The remote control snapped out of my hand so fast that my knuckles scraped against the armrest, and before I could even register the sting, Marcus was standing over me with that look he always wore when he thought no one else was watching, the look that said I was furniture that had started talking back. "Knock off this nonsense and get back to your room, old man," he said, loud enough that the words bounced off the high ceiling of the living room I used to call mine, back when this house still belonged to me and not to the bank account he'd married into. My daughter Denise was in the kitchen, close enough to hear, and I watched her shoulders tense, watched her decide, the way she always decided lately, that it was easier to keep chopping vegetables than to turn around. I was 71 years old, I had built 2 businesses from nothing, buried a wife I loved for 43 years, and raised the woman washing lettuce 12 feet away from me, and in that moment I was smaller than I had ever felt in my life, smaller than the day my own father told me I'd never amount to anything, smaller than the morning I signed the paper selling the house on Birchwood Lane because Marcus said it made more financial sense for all of us to live together under one roof. I didn't say a word. I stood up slowly, the way you do when your knees remind you of every year you've lived, and I walked back down the hallway to the room that used to be Denise's childhood bedroom, now stripped of its posters and repainted a flat, forgettable beige, and I closed the door softly behind me. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, took a breath and reached under the mattress for the small leather notebook I'd been keeping for the last 11 months. I opened it to the next blank page, dated it, and wrote down exactly what had just happened word for word, because by then I had learned that memory fades but ink does not, and I intended for every single thing Marcus Delgado had done in this house to exist somewhere he couldn't erase. To understand how a man who once negotiated 7-figure contracts across a boardroom table ended up flinching at his own son-in-law's voice in his own former living room, you have to go back 3 years, to the spring my wife Eleanor died. Eleanor and I had run a small chain of hardware stores together, for locations across the county, built up over 30 years from a single shop I'd bought with a demobilization loan and a stubborn refusal to fail. We were comfortable, not flashy, the kind of people who drove the same car for a decade and took one modest vacation a year, but we had done well and we had done it honestly. When Eleanor passed, something in me went quiet that never quite came back on. Denise, our only child, showed up every day for 3 weeks, cooked, cleaned, sat with me while I stared at nothing, and I loved her for it. The way you love someone who reminds you that grief hasn't erased everything good in the world. Her husband Marcus came too in those early weeks, bringing groceries, fixing a leaking faucet, saying all the right things about family sticking together. And if I'm honest, I let my guard down precisely because grief had hollowed out my instincts. Marcus worked as a regional finance manager for a mid-sized logistics company, the kind of job that came with a good suit and a company car but not, as I would later learn, nearly the income he implied. He had married Denise 9 years earlier and I had never fully warmed to him, not because of any single incident but because of a pattern I couldn't name back then, a way he had of steering conversations toward numbers, toward what things were worth, toward what my stores might sell for if I ever decided to retire. It was Marcus who first raised the idea of me selling the house on Birchwood Lane. He framed it as concern, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table 4 months after the funeral, telling me how worried he and Denise were about me rattling around alone in a 4-bedroom house, how a man my age shouldn't be climbing a ladder to clean gutters or driving 40 minutes to the store in icy weather, how family should be close in times like these. I want to be fair to him even now, even after everything, because some of what he said wasn't wrong. I was lonely. I did fall once, reaching for a box of Eleanor's old letters on a high shelf, and I did lie there on the hallway floor for almost 20 minutes before I managed to get up, telling no one because I was too proud and too frightened of what telling someone would mean. So when Marcus suggested I sell Birchwood Lane and move in with them, contributing the proceeds toward a larger family home we'd all share, it didn't sound like a trap. It sounded like love. Denise cried with relief when I agreed. I cried too, though for different reasons I didn't examine closely enough at the time. The house we bought together, the one Marcus was standing in when he yanked the remote from my hand, cost $640,000. My contribution, from the sale of Birchwood Lane and a chunk of my retirement savings, was $390,000 of that. Marcus and Denise's contribution, largely financed through a mortgage in their names alone, was the rest. At the time, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement to me, a man still fogged with grief who trusted his son-in-law's spreadsheets more than his own gut. What I didn't understand then, what took me the better part of 2 years to understand, was that the deed to the house was recorded solely in Marcus and Denise's names. My $390,000 had gone into a house I own no legal share of whatsoever. When I finally asked Marcus about this gently over dinner about 8 months after we'd moved in, he laughed in that easy, dismissive way of his and said, "Come on, Walter, we're family, it doesn't matter whose name is on a piece of paper." I remember the exact words because I wrote them down that same night, the way I'd started writing down small things that itched at me, not yet sure why I felt the need to keep a record, only knowing that some old instinct honed across decades of contracts and handshakes that turned sour was telling me to. The itching didn't stop. Small things accumulated the way water accumulates before a dam breaks, invisible until suddenly it isn't. I noticed that my monthly Social Security deposit, which I had agreed to contribute toward household expenses as part of our living arrangement, never seemed to correspond to any visible improvement in the household. I noticed that Marcus had, at some point I couldn't precisely pin down, become the sole signatory on the joint account we'd opened for shared bills, an account I had put an initial $25,000 into as a cushion. I noticed that when I asked simple questions about our finances, Marcus's answers grew longer and vaguer at the same time, a magician's trick of misdirection dressed up as reassurance. And I noticed, most painfully of all, that Denise had started deferring to him in ways she never used to, that the daughter who had once argued fiercely with me about everything from curfews to college majors now went quiet at dinner whenever Marcus's tone sharpened, the same quiet I would later watch her retreat into the day he tore the remote from my hand. The first real crack in my understanding came on an ordinary Tuesday, when I was looking for a stamp in the drawer of the small desk in what Marcus called his home office, a room I rarely entered because he'd made clear, without ever quite saying so, that it wasn't really open to me. I found the stamp. I also found a folder unlabeled, tucked behind a stack of old utility bills, containing printouts of an online account I didn't recognize, an investment account with a balance that made my chest tighten, over $180,000, opened 14 months earlier under Marcus's name alone. I am not a man who goes looking for trouble, and for one long moment I told myself it was none of my business, that a man is entitled to his own investments, that perhaps this was money Marcus had saved from his salary over years and simply hadn't mentioned. But the dates bothered me. The account had been opened 3 months after I'd handed over the $25,000 cushion for our joint account, and the initial deposit into that mysterious investment account, according to the printed statement, had been exactly $22,000. I did not confront him that day. I had learned across a long career of negotiations that the worst thing you can do when you discover leverage is to announce it before you know how to use it. Instead, I began, quietly and methodically, to build a record. I photographed documents on my old flip phone when I had the chance, always careful to return everything exactly as I'd found it. I started keeping receipts for anything I paid for out-of-pocket groceries, prescriptions, the increasingly frequent loans Marcus asked me for that were never repaid, small ones at first, $60 here, $200 there, always with some plausible reason, a car repair, a bill that came in higher than expected. I opened a private post office box 20 minutes away, using a small amount of cash I'd kept hidden since before Eleanor died. Money Marcus didn't know existed, and I began redirecting my bank statements there instead of to the house, so that no one could intercept or explain away what my own accounts actually showed. And I reached out carefully to the one person outside that house who I knew would never repeat a word I told him in confidence. My old friend and attorney Harold Vance, a man who had handled the incorporation papers for both my hardware stores back in the 70s and who had officiated informally at more family dinners than I could count. Harold listened to everything I told him one afternoon over coffee at a diner 3 towns over, far enough that I felt reasonably certain no one would recognize us. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to reassure me the way Denise sometimes did when I raised concerns, just took notes on a yellow legal pad in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting. When I finished, he set his pen down and said something I have never forgotten. "Walter, you built 2 successful businesses by never signing anything you hadn't read 3 times, and somewhere in the last 2 years grief made you stop reading." He wasn't wrong, and hearing it from him, rather than feeling ashamed, felt like being handed a map back to myself. Harold agreed to help me quietly, on the condition that I understood this wasn't going to be fast, and it wasn't going to be about revenge for its own sake. "The law doesn't care how angry you are," he told me. "It cares what you can prove." I told him I understood, though at the time I still thought the goal was simply to protect what remained of my money. I didn't yet know how much further this would go. Over the following months, The picture Harold and I assembled grew darker than I had expected. Using the documentation I'd gathered, along with records Harold was able to request through entirely legal channels once we understood what we were looking for, we discovered that the mysterious investment account wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern stretching back nearly 3 years, almost exactly to the time of Eleanor's death. Marcus had, it turned out, been quietly siphoning money not only from our shared household funds but, more seriously, from an escrow account at his own workplace, funds meant to cover client shipping deposits that he had borrowed, and always intended, according to what he later admitted, to pay back before anyone noticed. He never did fully pay it back. Instead, he had used a portion of those funds, combined with money drawn from me under the guise of household expenses and small loans, to build that private investment portfolio, one he apparently hoped would grow large enough to quietly replace what he'd taken from work before an audit ever caught up with him. It was, Harold explained gently, the classic shape of a man who believed he was smarter than the systems designed to catch people exactly like him, and who had, without ever quite admitting it to himself, decided that his wife's aging, grieving father made a convenient, uncomplaining source of interest-free credit. There was a second discovery, one that hurt in a different, quieter way. Going through old emails Denise had once, years earlier, given me the password to in case of emergency, and which I now used only because Harold assured me this fell within the bounds of what was legally permissible given the account had been shared with my knowledge, I found a thread from around the time Marcus first suggested I sell Birchwood Lane. In it, he had written to a friend, casually, almost proudly, "Walter's finally caving on the house thing. Once his name's off everything and it's just easier this way, we'll have way more breathing room. Denise doesn't need to know all the details. She gets weird about money stuff with her dad." Reading those words, I understood that the plan to bring me into their household hadn't been born purely of concern, however much genuine concern might have existed alongside it. Some part of it had been calculated from the very beginning, a strategy dressed in the language of love. I sat with that knowledge for a long time before I told Harold, and longer still before I decided what, if anything, I would ever tell Denise. The remote control incident, the one that opened this story, happened on a Thursday evening about 10 months into my quiet investigation, and it was, in its own strange way, the final piece I needed. I had been watching a documentary about small business owners rebuilding after economic downturns, something that reminded me, painfully, of the years I'd spent building my own stores from nothing, and Marcus had walked in wanting to watch a football game instead. I asked reasonably if we could finish the 20 minutes remaining in my program first. That was when he crossed the room, said the words that opened this story, and yanked the remote from my hand hard enough to scrape my knuckles. What made that moment different from 100 smaller humiliations before it wasn't the words themselves, cruel as they were, but what happened 3 seconds later, when Denise, standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, said nothing at all. "Not Marcus, that's not okay." Not even a glance in my direction. Just silence, and the sound of a knife going back to work on a cutting board. I understood, watching her, that whatever conversation Marcus and Denise had been having about me behind closed doors, it had reached a point where my daughter no longer felt she had standing to defend her own father in her own home. That was the moment I stopped thinking of what I was building with Harold as protection, and started thinking of it as something closer to rescue for both of us. I called Harold the next morning and told him I was ready to move. He reminded me, patiently, that being ready wasn't the same as being finished, and that we needed 2 more things before we acted: complete documentation of the household finances that would hold up if Marcus tried to challenge anything legally, and more delicately, some understanding of where Denise actually stood, because whatever else was true, I did not want to destroy my daughter's marriage over money if there was a version of this where she could see clearly and choose for herself. Harold suggested in his careful way that sometimes the truth doesn't need to be delivered by the person it will hurt the most. It can simply be made visible and left for people to find on their own timeline. That became our strategy. Over the following 6 weeks, working with a forensic accountant, Harold brought in a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Chatterjee who had spent a career untangling exactly this kind of quiet financial deception. We built a complete picture. Every dollar I had contributed to the household, every dollar diverted from our joint account into Marcus's private investment portfolio, and most damning of all, documentation strongly suggesting the source of a significant portion of that portfolio's early growth was the escrow funds from his employer. Priya was careful to tell me she couldn't prove criminal intent from outside records alone, Only patterns, but patterns, she said, were often enough to make the right people start asking the right questions. Harold's plan was elegant in its restraint. We were not going to accuse Marcus of anything ourselves. We were simply going to correct the legal and financial reality of the situation, transparently and lawfully, and let the natural consequences of his own choices do the rest. The first step was quiet but foundational. Because I had never signed away my claim to the $390,000 I'd contributed toward the house, only assumed, wrongly, that verbal family goodwill counted for something, Harold helped me file a formal claim establishing my equitable interest in the property, the kind of legal move available to anyone who can document a substantial financial contribution to a home they don't hold title to. This wasn't an eviction or an attack. It was simply the truth made official. The second step involved Priya quietly and appropriately flagging the pattern she'd identified in Marcus's employer's escrow records to a contact she knew in the company's internal audit department, done entirely through legitimate channels, framed as an observation worth investigating rather than an accusation. What happened after that was not something I controlled, orchestrated, or even directly caused. It was simply what happens when a house of numbers built on borrowed and diverted money finally meets someone whose job is to count carefully. The unraveling, when it came faster than I expected. Marcus's company launched an internal audit that, within 3 weeks, identified the exact pattern Priya had flagged: discrepancies in client escrow accounts totaling just over $90,000 over 2.5 years. He was placed on administrative leave the same week Harold's letter, formally establishing my equitable claim on the house, arrived by certified mail. I wasn't in the room when Denise opened that letter, but I understand from what she told me later that she read it twice before she understood what it meant, and then sat at the kitchen table for a long time before she came and knocked on my bedroom door, something she hadn't done in months. What followed wasn't the shouting match I had half expected and, if I'm honest, half dreaded. Denise came in, sat on the edge of the bed where I'd been writing in my notebook for nearly a year, and asked me very quietly whether it was true, all of it, the house, the account, the money he'd been asking to borrow. I could have softened it. Some part of me wanted to. Instead, I opened the notebook and let her read it herself, page by page, in my own handwriting, dated entry after dated entry, because I had learned by then that the truth lands differently when it comes wrapped in someone else's careful record rather than in an argument shaped by anger. She cried for a long time. Not, she told me later, because she hadn't suspected something was wrong, but because she had spent 2 years telling herself she was imagining it, telling herself that raising it would be unfair to a husband who was, in every other visible way, a good provider and a steady presence, and because somewhere in that same 2 years she had absorbed enough of his framing to start seeing my quiet withdrawal, my growing carefulness, as the early confusion of old age rather than what it actually was: a man protecting himself the only way he knew how. The confrontation with Marcus himself happened 4 days later, in the living room where he'd yanked the remote from my hand, though by then the television was off and the only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Harold was there, at my request, not to threaten anything but simply to make sure the conversation stayed grounded in facts rather than emotion. Priya had provided a summary, carefully worded, of what the internal audit at Marcus's company had uncovered, information that, by that point, Marcus already knew because he'd been questioned twice by his employer's compliance office. I did not raise my voice. I had spent 71 years learning that the person who raises their voice first in a negotiation has usually already lost the negotiation. I simply laid out, calmly, everything Harold and Priya and I had documented. The money, the dates, the account, the email about not needing to tell Denise the details. I told him that I would not be pursuing criminal charges myself, since the escrow matter belonged rightfully to his employer and potentially to law enforcement depending on what they decided to do with their findings, but that I would be formalizing my legal claim on the house, recovering what I could of the money he'd borrowed from me directly through a private repayment agreement Harold had drafted, and that going forward, my finances would be entirely separate from his, permanently, in writing, notarized, unambiguous. Marcus tried for a while the same tools that had worked on both of us for so long. He called it a misunderstanding. He called Priya's involvement an invasion of his privacy. He looked at Denise and said, in a voice gone suddenly thin, that he'd only ever done any of it to protect their future, that a man in his position sometimes had to take risks, that her father clearly didn't understand how modern finances worked. But Denise, sitting beside me instead of beside him for the first time in longer than either of us could probably say, didn't look away this time. She asked him in a steady voice I recognized from her childhood, back when she used to argue me into the ground about curfews, whether it was also protecting their future when he told his friend not to bother telling her the details. He didn't have an answer for that. Some silences say everything the loudest arguments never managed to. The weeks that followed were not simple, and I want to be honest about that because a tidy resolution would be a lie, and I promised myself in that leather notebook that I would only ever write down what actually happened. Marcus was terminated from his job 2 weeks after the confrontation, once the internal audit concluded and his employer determined, through their own separate investigation, that the escrow discrepancies were not accidental. Whether criminal charges follow is, as of the writing of this account, still working its way through channels I have no control over and frankly, no further interest in personally pursuing. Priya's involvement ended the moment she'd flagged a legitimate pattern to legitimate professionals, and what happens next belongs to systems built for exactly this purpose. Denise did not leave Marcus immediately, though she did, with Harold's guidance, secure her own separate legal and financial protections, opening accounts he had no access to, consulting her own attorney about the house and their joint assets, taking the kind of careful, unemotional steps I recognized, with a strange mixture of pride and sorrow, as very much her father's daughter. Whether their marriage survives what's been uncovered is a story still being written, and not one I feel it's my place to finish for her. What I can tell you is what changed for me. Harold and I finalized my legal claim on the house, and rather than force a sale or an ugly petition, Denise and I worked out an arrangement, drawn up properly and signed by everyone involved, where I received back the bulk of my original contribution, funds I used to buy a small, comfortable condominium 15 minutes from Denise, close enough to see my daughter and, God willing, grandchildren someday, but entirely, unambiguously my own. I put my name on the deed myself this time, and I read every single page 3 times before I signed it, the way Harold once gently reminded me I used to. I recovered a portion of the money Marcus had borrowed directly from me, structured as a repayment agreement rather than a gift disguised as generosity, and I put every dollar of it into a modest trust that Harold helped me establish, one with clear, specific, professionally drafted terms about who can access it, when and under what conditions, terms that no future son-in-law, however charming, however reasonable sounding over a kitchen table, will ever be able to quietly reinterpret. I still keep the leather notebook. I don't write in it as often now, mostly because there isn't much left to document, but I keep it in the drawer of my new desk in my new condominium not as a trophy or a weapon, but as a reminder of something I nearly forgot in the fog of grief and the exhausting kindness of people who ask too little of themselves and too much of you. Eleanor used to say that the surest sign of a good deal was that both people walked away feeling like they'd gotten something fair, and the surest sign of a bad one was that only one person was doing all the explaining. I forgot that for a while, sitting in a house that wasn't mine, listening to a man tell me over and over in 100 small ways that family didn't need paperwork, that love didn't need documentation, that an old man ought to be grateful for whatever roof he was given. I know better now. Denise came to the condominium last Sunday alone, and we sat on the small balcony with 2 cups of coffee and didn't talk about Marcus at all. Just about her mother, about the stores, about a garden she wants to plant that reminds her of the one Eleanor kept on Birchwood Lane. At one point she reached over and took my hand, the same hand that had been scraped raw reaching for a remote control 11 months earlier, and she said quietly that she was sorry it took her so long to really see what was happening in her own home. I told her what I've come to believe is the truest thing I learned across this whole difficult year. That dignity, once you've decided to reclaim it, doesn't need to be loud to be real, and that the quietest, most patient kind of justice is often the kind that lasts.